Hey, I'm replacing exhaust manifolds on this 2004 Limited, and I just figured I would show you the process as well as give you some tips and tricks. So check this out. I've already got the old manifolds out from this engine, but let me just talk to you about it for a second. Here's the driver's side one. You can see this big old crack, this hole in there right there. So this is super common. This is going to happen on every single Gen 3 Montero and Gen 2 Montero as well at some point. I mean, by this point, these manifolds are like 20 years old. They've gone through so many heat cycles. This cast metal, it's natural that at this point you're seeing failures everywhere. So very common problem. I think it pretty much affects 100% of Gen 2 and Gen 3 Monteros. And Gen 1s, it happens to them as well. So anyways, first thing that you're wondering is, how do you know if you have a cracked exhaust manifold? And the reason that this is a problem is because it lets in air into the system, and that air is going to increase your fuel to air ratio on the air side. The car is going to detect that through the oxygen sensors, and it's going to want to correct for it. So it's going to be a lean condition is what it's going to detect. But you might actually get a code for a rich condition because the computer is going to bump up the amount of fuel, and it's going to drastically reduce your miles per gallon. That's going to be your best hint other than sound. So your best hint's going to be sound. When you fire up your car in the morning when it's cold, it's going to kind of sound like a dirt bike, kind of like, you know, like a car that's had its muffler removed. You're going to get a little of that, like farting noise, kind of from the front of the engine. And that's just the air coming out through this crack. And then as this manifold heats up, it's kind of going to self-seal that crack a little bit, and that noise will go away. So on a cold start, you'll have that noise. Secondly, you may have a code that could say rich, could say lean. And thirdly is your MPGs are going to go way down. Your computer is going to bump up the amount of fuel to try and equalize that fuel to air ratio, and now more air is getting in than supposed to. So if you are experiencing any of those problems in your Montero and you want to confirm if you have a cracked exhaust manifold, there's a couple ways. You can go and get a smoke tester like this. This is pretty simple. It's just like a can. You put some mineral oil in it, you plug it in, you hook up an air compressor, and you pump in smoke into the system, and then you see if it's coming out from the manifold anywhere. And this is like a really cheap one. I'll link to it in the description, of course. It's okay. It's kind of garbage, but you only need to use it, you know, every now and then. Like if you were a professional mechanic, yeah, you don't want to use this one. But it pretty much pays for itself. Like you use it once, you've already paid for it because it's like $100. And if you were to pay a shop to diagnose, to do a smoke test on your Montero, they're going to charge you $100 at least. So it's worth having. Now, one thing that this does not come with is something to test the exhaust system. That's what you're going to need to buy separately. This, you can just put up the tailpipe to seal it, and then it'll be pumping the smoke directly into the tailpipe. It'll work its way up the exhaust piping through the muffler, and then it'll go up into the exhaust manifolds. Now, one quick thing to point out about that. If you notice smoke coming out of your muffler, that's okay. Mufflers are built with drain holes for getting rid of the condensation that builds up in them overnight. So it's totally normal to have a few spots, depending on the muffler design, like aftermarket ones have them in different places, but it's normal for some smoke to be coming out of your muffler. And then, you know, it'll travel up. And of course, you can watch to see if you have any exhaust leaks on the connections, like where two pipes come together, and then it'll go up to the manifolds. And then you can just look from underneath the car as well as from above to see if you're getting any smoke coming out of your manifold. Remember, when these are installed on the car, you're not going to really be able to see much because they're covered up by a heat shield from the top. But if you see any smoke kind of like coming up from around here, you got a really good sign. Now, a lot of times you don't even need to smoke test the exhaust manifolds, just go underneath the car, crawl under there with a flashlight, and when you look on the underside, so it'll be like that, and when you look on the underside of the car, on the manifold, you'll be able just to see the crack with your flashlight because the heat shield doesn't cover the underside. So if you don't have a smoke test, just go start there. Then once you've confirmed that you have cracked exhaust manifolds, we of course sell replacement ones. And let me show you how to remove them. Let's start on the passenger side. The passenger side is the easier of the two sides. All you have to do is remove your intake system. So you've got like the scoop that goes to the pipe, that goes to the air box. So you just need to remove all that. That's very easy. I mean, it's a bolt here, a bolt here. You open up, then you undo your rubber hose from the throttle body, and then you open up the lid, unplug your mass airflow sensor, and all that lid and everything will come off. And then from the airbox, there's 3 10 millimeter or 12 millimeter bolts, I should say. I think they're 12 that go right there, and your airbox is out of the way. Then you'll have access to this side of the engine. There's an EGR pipe that goes on the passenger side. Let me show you that real quick. So here's the EGR pipe that's in there. This end with that big nut right there, that's going into the manifold. So I just use like a big crescent wrench, like an adjustable crescent wrench, to remove that side. And then on the other side, it's just a couple 10 millimeter bolts that are attached just underneath the throttle body on the intake manifold. So that way you can get the EGR tube out. Next will come your heat shield on this side, and that's just 3 10 millimeter bolts. And as you can see, access on this side is really good. So then you'll have your exhaust manifold right here. On the cylinder head side, there are just these 7 studs coming out of the cylinder head that just have a nut and a washer on them. And so you just remove those. You know, one thing you may want to do if you're planning on doing this is soak everything with penetrating oil. All the bolts that are going to need to be removed, just hit them like 24 hours, 48 hours, just hit them a few times with penetrating oil, and it'll make this job easier. Exhaust bolts can sometimes be a nightmare to free, and sometimes these studs can break. It's never happened to me, but I know people that have happened to. I don't live in a high rust area, but another thing I think that might be useful is to try it on like a hot engine with everything heated up, and that might help your chances. If you do end up breaking one of these studs, that's not going to be fun, but we do have replacement studs that go into the cylinder head. It is something that we stock because guys have run into this in the middle of a job. I should also note the studs going into the cylinder head are not the same studs that go in the bottom of the manifold. So if we look at, let me just show you the passenger side manifold. There's these studs that will come with your new exhaust manifold that you need to install here on the flange. And these studs are not the same size as the ones that go into the cylinder head. So keep that in mind. But we have both sizes available. Even if, you know, yours will come with 2 of these for the exhaust manifold. And if you need extras, we have extras. But, and yeah, the way that you install these is you just use 2 nuts and you stack them on top of each other to drive this down and seat it in place. In order to get your exhaust manifold out, I would recommend that before you take off these 7 nuts, I would start with the hardest thing first, and that's going to be the nuts that are down here that attach the downpipe to the exhaust manifold. So let's go under there and take a look at those. All right, so I'm under the car, and here is the section of downpipe that, just trying to get my light here for you guys, that attaches to that exhaust manifold. Now right now it's like folded down. I ended up removing more than you will because I'm doing some other work that I'll talk about in a second. But anyways, this downpipe will be going basically up like that to the exhaust manifold, and it'll meet right about here. And so I would start with removing those 2 bolts. I believe that they are 17 millimeter, and you can get an impact on them with an extension. So if you get a strong impact gun with an extension, you'll be able to reach them, and you'll get those 2 17 millimeter bolts out. Again, pre-soak them with penetrating fluid. That'll make your life a lot easier. Same thing on the driver's side. You can see that's where the driver's side one was. I just got a bag over it right now so I don't drop anything into the downpipe, into the catalytic converter area. But again, you can reach it with an impact gun with some extensions down from below. I think the hardest one is probably, if I remember right, the far left one on the driver's side to get access to, but it is doable. You just have to find the right angle to bring your impact gun up through with extensions. And this Y pipe here is not factory on this vehicle. This is an aftermarket one, and so it's been replaced at some point. So that's why, if you're trying to compare why this looks a little different than yours, that's why. So, you know, you're gonna need to get the downpipe bolts out, then the 7 nuts off of the cylinder head up there, and you can do that from up top. And then you'll be able to try and remove your exhaust manifold, but it may not come out, especially I think on the driver's side one. And what you need to do is loosen the, sorry, I'm trying to get some light. You need to loosen the bolts on the downpipe. So this is the passenger side one. You can see I've removed one bolt entirely, and I've just loosened this one. So it's got some flex in it. And then you'll want to do the same thing on, where are we at here? On the driver's side, which was connected right there. I just, yeah, you can see this one is completely removed. Like this piece of Y pipe used to go into here, which goes to your main catalytic converter. I've completely removed the Y pipe. You don't need to do that. You just need to loosen the connection, and that'll give you enough movement in the Y pipe to be able to take your exhaust manifolds out, because you need to be able to pull this Y pipe down a little bit to be able to get those studs that are placed in the exhaust manifold to pull out enough so that you can free it. See that you got a metal gasket in between the cylinder head and where the exhaust manifold was. We also sell replacement ones of those. I always replace them when I do this job because I don't have to do this again, and I'm not gonna like risk it on a whatever, on a $15 gasket. I also recommend buying a new one of these gaskets for the connection to the Y pipe. The only other gasket that you may want to replace during this job is the one that goes on the EGR tube that connects it to the intake manifold. Let's talk about removal of the driver's side exhaust manifold. So essentially it's the same. Start from underneath, remove those 2 bolts from the Y pipe connection to the exhaust manifold. But in order to get access to this, you can see it's not as open as the passenger side. So you're gonna need to take out your battery tray, which is 3 12 millimeter bolts and 1 10 millimeter bolt right here in this corner. So remove your battery tray, and then you want to remove, there's a big bracket here that you use to like lift the engine, remove that. A couple wire, there's like a wire harness in the way for the O2 sensor, just remove that. And then there's the 2 dipsticks. So the oil and the transmission dipstick tube, and then you want to remove that. The oil one just pops right out, I believe. Like there's gonna be like a bolt holding each one to that bracket. So that's easy. And the oil one pops right out. The transmission one, before you can remove that dipstick, you need to go from underneath, and you'll see where it's bolted up against the side of the transmission. So here's the oil dipstick one. It's the easier one to remove. There's just that one mount location, and it's high up on the engine. So you remove that, and then you can just pop this right out. And then here's the transmission dipstick. You can see it's a little more difficult because you've got the mount at the top, easy to remove, but then there's another mount at the bottom near where it goes into the transmission. So you just need to crawl under there, and it's like a single 10 millimeter bolt. Access is not the easiest, but it's not impossible. So then pop that out. And then you may want to have, like if you have an O-ring kit, have that handy You can see like my O-ring there is kind of smashed and everything, so I'm gonna wanna replace that before I put it back in there just to make sure I'm not getting any transmission fluid leaks. And then once you've gotten those dipsticks out of your way, you will have enough room to get to the driver's side exhaust manifold. Same thing as the other side, there's those 7 studs. Okay, so let's say you've got your exhaust manifolds out. Now this is a great time to inspect your motor mounts because you can see here is the motor mount on the driver's side of the engine. Very easy to access now that we've gotten that exhaust manifold out of the way. Take a look at your motor mounts and inspect the rubber for cracks. You can go from underneath with a flashlight and you'll be able to have a real good view of the rubber on these things. I found that the passenger side was fine, but the driver's side one was destroyed. Check this thing out. Barely, barely attached at all. So these are some pretty gnarly pieces of rubber. So that's kind of like what it looked like when I looked through with a flashlight from the side. I could see that giant tear in it. That's what you're looking for, a tear in this rubber. And so now's a great time to replace your motor mounts. We stock these, I'll link to them, of course, in the description. It's pretty interesting. It's like a giant piece of rubber, but it's not just rubber. Inside of here, there's like a cavity that's filled with oil. So pretty interesting. This one, of course, doesn't have any more oil in it. Long gone. All right, so I've got a separate video on replacing motor mounts. So if you guys want to check that out, go over to that video. But for now, we're just going to pick right back up with replacing the exhaust manifolds. To get your new exhaust manifolds set up to install, you're going to get a hardware bag with 2 studs. And then you can see you're just going to feed the small end of the stud. They're not equal. You can see one side has less threads than the other. The short side, thread it into the exhaust manifold. Then take the 2 original nuts that were on these 2 studs on the original manifold and thread them onto the stud like that. So their threads are together. Part where the box wrench goes is together. And then you're just going to use a 19 millimeter box wrench on them. As you do, and as you put some torque on that, it's going to drive the stud down into the manifold. Now you don't got to go crazy, but you do want, you do want to get part of that metal on the stud to kind of seat itself into the flange on the manifold. But yeah, you don't need to go crazy with it, just till it kind of starts to bite. You can also put the nuts like this end to end, and all that really matters is when you're cranking on that second one, it's pushing the stud down deeper and deeper into the flange. Then when you're done, to break this connection, put your wrench on the inside nut and hold it tight in place while you then take another tool onto the outside one, and you're gonna loosen the outside one while keeping the inside one from moving. If you don't do that, if you just try loosening the outside one, then the whole stud can spin itself out. Then to remove the inside nut, put a nut on the back side piece of stud that's sticking out the flange, and then put your wrench on there, and so then be holding it tight while you break this side free. And I usually do it like a snapping motion to kind of like just break it free, and then it'll spin off by hand, as opposed to like a gradual pull, which will build up that torque on the stud. Worst case scenario, what if you go to install your Y pipe and these studs are just spinning, and you try to tighten these studs back into this flange and they're just spinning, you can always just go get 2 new nuts, put them on the back side and tighten them down to keep this attached. So you don't need to. I'm just saying, if you get into a situation where you can't get them tight, that's always an option to make this work. I believe these are M10 by 1.5 inch pitch, just by looking at them. That's going to be my guess. So as you can see, even on the driver's side where access is tighter, you can still get to your motor mount with the exhaust manifold in place. It's just a lot easier. You just have more room to work with if you are doing this job anyways. So that's why I wanted to point it out. So on installation, first thing I did, especially if you have one where the valve covers are leaking oil, is I cleaned the mating surface on the cylinder head. And then I put my new gasket, and then I put the exhaust manifold on. I put this exhaust manifold on finger tight. See, the washers and the nuts are just on there finger tight so that this still has movement in it. Then I go down below and I button everything up down below, like the Y pipe, I get it all torqued to spec and installed, fitted correctly. When I've tried to do it the other way, like tighten this down and then do the piping, I can never get the piping like seated perfectly to where there's not any exhaust leaks down there. So now I do it in this order. It's also worth noting that these new gaskets, they all go on dry. So whether that's the gasket between the flange on the Y pipe and the manifold, the gasket between the cylinder head and the manifold, and then on the other side, that EGR tube gasket, they're all dry. No sealants, RTVs, none of that.
So that's it. Here's the torque specs. The main ones here would be the 33 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds for the manifolds to the cylinder head, and the 37 plus or minus 7 foot-pounds where the manifold connects to the Y pipe. Once you get everything all buttoned up, I would recommend at some point after that, just go ahead and retest the system with another smoke test. Make sure that there's no leaks coming out of any of those joints on the exhaust piping that you had loosened up. So that's it. Very common problem for Monteros, and this is how you get it solved. Thanks so much.